like how you start off with using the analogy of the coffee cup handle. Could you please explain that?
Yeah, so that's a good illustration, or just a really basic illustration of the necessity of purpose and form and sort of the problem of purpose and form. And I'm drawing from Peterson and others, but citing Peterson at least here, where we actually like our physical neurological apparatus of perception presents us with information that is in the form of a purposeful story. We the information that we immediately get when we see a coffee cup is a cup to hold something and a handle to grasp with. We see the purpose before we see the object. So our primary perception is purposeful. That raises some issues for some people, even though it kind of uh, should be helpful. It should just say clearly purpose is built into everything. But because we have sort of these modern myths drifting around, we turn back and doubt that. So when we can't deny that we see the purpose of a handle, we see something for grasping. But we can, with the background of emergent consciousness and the myth of just randomly generated existence, um, we can suppose, well, maybe that like my apparatus of perception that is forcing me to perceive purpose is an aberration, is something that is imposing my little misinformed and selfish agenda on the world. Where yes, we've made a coffee cup with a handle and we take that for granted, but then we do the same thing with a tree. You know, we either see a tree as an object of beauty if we have it planted in a yard where we want it, or it's something in the way if it's going in, you know, where we want a road to go, a potential hazard if it's growing over a house, or, you know, something to climb if you're a kid, or something for birds to nest, whatever it is. We see purpose in it, and then especially with natural objects, that sort of modern person looks at that and goes, "This is a unfair and unjust human imposition. We are putting a purpose onto that thing that is just a hallucination of our own minds, whereas this thing just sort of exists for itself, and we're, you know, harming it in a way, or doing injustice to it by just by the act of our perception, our basic perception that supposes purpose." So that's sort of the modern problem that people see with purpose and form, even though they see it's sort of inevitable, or some of them are beginning to see that it's sort of inevitable. Um, but this just sort of goes back to everything we've been talking about and is built off all the myths that hopefully at this point we've uprooted.
I mean, it's kind of just inherently human to attribute purpose to form. I mean, it's
It
it's
is.
borderline. I mean, you can't not do it.
Mhm.
It's hardwired in, it's built in. And to think that attributing certain sets of purposes purposes to
Mhm.
to an object, it that to me, thinking that that is an illusion, that doesn't, because if, let's say you have a coffee, let's say you have a cup, and you have 100 different people at different times going into a room to utilize this cup, or to engage with this cup. Most people are going to, on their own, figure out the utility of that object as a cup. Therefore, they've attributed purpose to that object as being a cup. So
Mhm.
if, let's say, several people do this without communication, it's just inherent, to utilize that object as a cup. I mean, wouldn't that somewhat dispel the notion that it could be an illusion? if collectively people are engaging with it in the exact same way?
I think in happier times, less chronically and what did you say, malignantly skeptical times, then yes. Um, but the issue has been pushed further back than that, right? We can accept that there are these um, archetypes or human universals or whatever, um, to some degree. I mean, people debate about that, or don't want to notice that, but that's a separate issue. But even the people who are swayed by nihilism can look at that and say, yes, we see it all across humans, but that's because basically what they're saying is that's because all humans are broken, right? The claim basically gets pushed back to this level of our our consciousness itself is an illusion, an aberration, and or insignificant. Any one or combination of those. Our own, and I think this is the underlying um, I think this is the core of nihilism. It's the claim that your consciousness is insignificant, right? Whatever that's sort of whatever comes up. Well, oh, here's a claim to the contrary. Well, remember, you're just a broken thing that is here haphazardly for no reason and doesn't really understand anything, and whatever else the continual commentary is. So there's this assumption that, and it really is an assumption. It's based off a pure mythology of just, well, what if at the beginning of everything it was all random and done for no reason? There's no actual evidence for that. That's a mythology that's tacked on to the hypothesis of evolution and spontaneous generation of life from microscopic forms. But even if you believe in evolution and spontaneous generation of life, you could look at that same evidence and say, yes, life began to evolve from tiny molecules that miraculously started self-replicating. And that's because God had a plan and he set it all in order. So you could look at the same evidence and insert either mythology on top of it. So it is just a story. It's a mythology. It's a story that structures how you interpret the evidence. So we have this mythology um, that we are ultimately purposeless. And therefore, when we see that we are actually hardwired to perceive purpose, we look at that and say, oh, well, that's because we're just sort of messed up, unintentional creatures that don't know what's going on. Versus someone with a more traditional point of view that believes in purpose inherent in the cosmos and inherent in all life, then you see that we're hardwired to perceive purpose. And you say, oh, of course. Well, that's because we're intentionally designed and purpose is part of the world and we're supposed to interact with purpose. So we see purpose. So it really is a mythology. But there are so many people who have accepted this mythology that they are in that position where sort of no matter what you throw at them, they always retreat to this assumption that, well, because I've already taken for granted that we are unintentional, purposeless beings, therefore our consciousness is insignificant. And then that puts you in the vicious cycle of any evidence to the contrary. You just have that little guy on your shoulder who says, well, that's just something you would like to believe because you're a flawed, purposeless creature that has all these, desires that aren't real, and you fantasize about your own significance, but it's really not there. You're just this backwater, infinitesimal speck in the cosmos, and nothing you ever did or do would ever matter. So that I think that is the core of the nihilism, is the idea that your own consciousness is insignificant.
Yeah, and it's interesting you just brought up Darwinian evolution, and that was going to be a point that was going to be my next point, in that it seems that nihilism and the theory of evolution kind of go in tandem. They really work with one another because if you fully, it seems like there's a different end of the spectrum. It's like either this grand world was bestowed upon us by the Lord, and it's a playground for us to attribute purpose to various things and interact with it and build, potentially. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, well, you are a byproduct of adapting to the environment from a molecular level. You evolved to a booger, and then that booger just randomly got washed up on a beach, and slowly over time you evolved into what we are now. Uh,
Yeah.
and that inherently you can say like, okay, then if we adapted to the environment in such a way over a long process to where, just that's you could see how meaningless that is because there's nothing else there. It's like, oh, we just haphazardly became what we are, and it's a freak show, it's just a crazy happenstance, and here we are until we just eventually die off, versus the complete other end of the spectrum. So I don't know if maybe, I mean, I doubt it. I mean, maybe I don't know. Uh, it's like the implementation of that theory of evolution, regardless of, let's say, the desire of people to put out, what they perceive to be the truth. It seems like it's had a somewhat negative effect on the world
Yeah.
since it was put out there. People really started to turn from that. Metaphysical way of thinking from religion into more of that science backed. Well, I need to see that, I need to see that 2 + 2 = 4 right in front of me. Otherwise, it's not 100% real. Would you say that that's fairly accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's accurate, an accurate description of how things have happened. Um, and this is something we talked about before, where the problem with the modern secularists is that they are handing on a doctrine that has the seeds of nihilism sort of latent in it and ready to spring up, and they have no defenses against that nihilism. But part of the point that I was making that I think is really important is that the theory of evolution, even though as it developed, it did immediately go hand in hand with sort of a rebellion against religion and the supposition of random, haphazard generates meaningless, spontaneous generation. Um, that's not a necessary connection. The theory opens up the door for someone to say, well, if all this just sort of happened, then maybe there's no reason behind it. But that's a further conjecture. That's another step, and that's another story that you're tacking on top of evolution. And I think it's perfectly plausible for someone to accept absolutely everything that's in the theory of evolution that's actually about evolution, and still to say, well, that spontaneous generation at the beginning was purposeful and was an act of God and happened within a universe that was purposed. So it's really not the theory of evolution itself per se. It is in this world the way that it has proceeded, the way that we understand it. They do come hand in hand, but it's not a necessary connection. That is actually very clearly an extra mythology that is so melded in our minds with the theory of evolution that they go together. But you could easily separate them and just say, well, we actually don't know whether spontaneous generation was purposeful or not purposeful. That's an assumption either way. Um, so yeah, I think that's really helpful just to see that is a it's a faith. It's a complete faith. It's an assumption, a metaphysical assumption tacked on to the beginning of creation. Just like people who look at the Big Bang and they say, well, God did it. Okay. Like that's a faith, right? There's not explicit evidence to back that up. You can make uh, claims based on later evidence that supposedly, looks back and helps support that, but there's not explicit evidence. You don't have it's a silly example, but you don't have a photo of God like making Big Bang go? The same thing, you can look back at the beginning of evolution or beginning of Big Bang, whatever it is, well, and you just say, well, no reason. There was no reason. It just happened. That's a conjecture. That's completely faith-based. There's no evidence for it. It's just it's a metaphysics. It's a metaphysical assumption that determines your mindsets and how you interpret everything downstream from that. So I think that's helpful to note.